Let me give you a little bit of history based on some of my own experiences. When we started Odyssey, we just wanted a school of our own. We came from diverse backgrounds and really didn't find anything that fit what we were looking for, so why not start your own school, right? So it was really Paul and Amy Waldron, and Julie helped us get started. We had a barbecue, I believe, in the Waldron's backyard, and Julie generously came to show us how to make a high-performing school. Julie's with John Hancock and Canyon Grove, is that right?
That's right, thank you.
And so we thought, great, fill out the charter. Anytime you start a school, or you want to start a school, you just can't rent a building and put a sign out. There's the question of authority. Every child knows this. They say, you're not the boss of me, right? And so you have to be authorized to start a school. Who authorizes you to start a school? It's the state legislature through an act created the Utah State Office of Education, and they are authorized to approve or reject charters, and you can start a school. Our charters often describe our ends, such as the focus, the mission, why we started the school, and often it includes a lot of means as well, like our organization of the board, some methods of pedagogy and curriculum. Send the application to the Utah State Office of Education, and they'll approve it or deny it and give you money. Your charter describes also, in many cases, how your board works. The board is authorized by the state to implement its charter. So now what? You have a board, you have a building, you have a high-performing board, typically. The board members figure out things like curriculum, dress code, salaries, special education, library books, fire code, right? They do it all. And the board runs, and the school runs, and the board runs the school, and it's exhausting. So you could contrast this with how effective boards work. They hire a CEO of a corporation, right? If you're a high-performing corporation, you hire a high-performing CEO and authorize them. You delegate your authority as a board to the CEO, and you get out of the way. Another way you can do this is to hire a management company, and many schools are run by a management company, and that can work well. Now, what happens when the director or the CEO, I'm going to use the term director and CEO interchangeably. CEO, I use to emphasize the E, executive. They are authorized to execute the things that the board wants to do. So what happens when your CEO is not doing what you want them to do? Well, you have a lot of options. You can fire them, right? You can bring them in and talk to them sternly. Do you have some policies to help guide you through those interactions? Whenever you delegate authority, you have you run into the possibility of an authority tug of war. How does the board ensure that the director does what they want them to? And how can they tell if the director's doing a good job? Do you have a clear set of guidelines to measure these things? So what often happens is that the board might override a director's decisions in some cases. And this is a great way to keep directors moving through your school, by the way. Because when you authorize someone and then override them, you're saying, we don't need you. And when you don't authorize someone, you say, we don't trust you. So in either case, this is a situation that plays out in many cases where a board is inexperienced and doesn't know how to delegate its authority. Here's an example. The board says to a director, we want you to focus on science. Our science scores have been in the toilet for the last number of years. Can you fix this? Director says, I got it. So currently, the school just has this ad hoc curriculum. Every teacher does what they want. Some grades do better than others. So the principal spends a year researching the problem and finds a curriculum that has worked really well for many schools. And he does his research, or she does her research, and eventually brings it to the board in a meeting. The board rejects the new curriculum for largely unscientific or sentimental reasons. And of course, the scores don't improve, and the principal's fired or the CEO's fired. So this is the situation. When a board authorizes an agent to act on its behalf, and then requires that agent to continue to seek approval for its actions, his or her actions, or dictates the means by which that agent should act, that agent can no longer be held accountable for success. Yet often is. And this conflict of interest plays out in the large and in the small, unless the board holds itself to some rigorous standards of behavior and an internally consistent model of governance. So a good governance model can help boards delegate all of the authority necessary to run the school well, and still ensure that the board achieves the purposes stated in its charter. So in my experience, it is a lot easier to find, I won't say a lot, it is easier to find one high-performing, skilled, talented CEO and pay them well than to find 5 to 7 or 9 high-performing, skilled, talented CEOs and ask them to volunteer many hours a month. So let's get philosophical here. Why does your school exist? Answers, really. Why do you have a school?
Educate students.
Educate students. Ding, ding, ding. Survey says. Why else? Why do we start schools?
Ours was to narrow the achievement gap between the underserved, specifically diverse populations, Pacific Islanders.
You have a specific mission for your school.
Yes, with the pipeline to be college educated.
Very good. We will get to that in a moment. This is why we started our Odyssey. The distinction between teaching and learning is both subtle and massive. We often focus on teaching because that is the activity most often associated with learning, and it's easy to observe and measure. But schools do not exist for teachers to teach. They exist for students to learn. And it's easy to demonstrate a teacher teaching. You just wait. But sometimes it's difficult to demonstrate that a student is learning. So a charter school exists so that the students who attend it will receive the benefits promised in its charter. That's what you said. That's the only reason that a charter school exists. There are no other good reasons. High-performing schools have boards with a laser-like focus on this single objective. So we'll talk about policy governance for just a moment now. Boards have many different modes, and some of them are really successful models. Beg your pardon. Okay. The Carver Policy Governance model is a simply, highly codified, and internally consistent way of governing a corporation. It is easy to learn and provides all of the controls necessary for due diligence that a board needs. And when done well, it can help boards focus on intended outcomes. Policy governance helps the director or the CEO by helping the board delegate its authority and then holding those to whom it has delegated authority accountable for its use and then gets out of the way. My personal experience is that while the policy governance is fairly simple, implementing the Carver model takes some serious commitment to learn it, at least 2 to 4 years. And it also helps to have longer board terms to reduce board turnover. If I were starting another school, I would probably push for 3-year terms. Just advice, unsolicited. John Carver is the author of the policy governance model. He said that policy governance is a comprehensive set of integrated principles that, when consistently applied, allows governing boards to realize owner-accountable organizations. I want to be clear that I'm not pushing policy governance. We used it, and a lot of people have been interested in it. Mr. Shellhouse, when he goes to his director meetings, gets questions all the time about what are you doing, why is this working? It worked well for Odyssey. It has not worked well for many schools for a variety of reasons, and I'll talk a little bit more of that in a moment. Doing policy governance is really an investment, and just as a school has a hard time getting inertia when you're turning directors over, that's the same with the board. If you're turning your board members over every year or every 2 years, you can't get a consistent model for governing. 3 years gives you enough time, in my opinion, to overlap, to get the new board members acclimated to your model and comfortable with it, and hopefully advocate it as well.
What is the Odyssey model now?
It's 2 years, I think. So let me share just a little bit more history. This is personal history now. This was Odyssey when it started. We had 5 very high-performing board members: a COW, Chief Administrative Officer, Financial Operational Officer, etc. The director reported to each of them, right, Nyman?
Yep.
Nyman was our first director. And each officer had oversight of different responsibilities. And the board handles many management and operational issues. Does this sound familiar? So this is less of a board of trustees than a board of directors. Each board member has a well-defined operational role, and many schools start out this way. We did, and it's, we got through that. When you can find a handful of high-performing individuals who are willing to volunteer their time and put things together, it's amazing. It's wonderful. But they get tired after a while. There's a lot of pushing, a lot of conflicts that you have to deal with day to day. So the board is concerned with operational matters. There's no time for long-term strategic thinking. You get the mommy-daddy problems. You know what the mommy-daddy problem is? If you don't like what mommy says, you go to daddy. If you don't like what daddy says, you go to mommy, right? And one's going to override the other if they don't know, if you don't have a good, solid communication line. So the board is worrying about uniforms, staff parent problems, curricula, expenses, fundraising, hiring, carpool grounds, maintenance, student placement, testing. That driving energy that once fuels the starting of a board and keeps its performance up is gone, and it feels like the school is losing its way. In 2008, the Odyssey Charter School contracted with Dr. Brian Carpenter to teach them policy governance. Policy governance is I may have read this before, a complete operating system for boards derived from the 10 principles of policy governance, and which enables a board to focus on achieving the organization's ends, the reason why your school exists, rather than the means of getting there, and creates a clear and consistent line of authority between the board and its CEO. And as I mentioned before, policy governance helped our school figure out that relationship between the board and the director and how to set up policies so that the board was not meddling in operational issues anymore. There was a clear distinction between the 2 roles, and it gives the director tons of latitude to be creative and do what they do best. Our school board meetings went from 1 to 3, we had 1 or 2 3 to 4 hour meetings per month to one meeting, one 60 to 90 minute meeting 10 to 12 times per year. So it really they gave us our lives back. It was so nice. It was so hard during those years. Oh man. So again, I'm not trying to sell this, just explain it how it worked for us. And if you have other questions, I'll answer them. The policy governance model is the simplest way of implementing the policy governance principles. So it's difficult for many schools to implement consistently. But you know what? What are your options? You're a school, you're running, you want to do the best you can. So there are some principles, and these principles are, we'll talk about them right now. There are 10 of them. These are 10 board behavior patterns, and some have to do with the board recognizing its position of authority, and others have to do with just regular, consistent actions the board should be taking. Any organization that follows these 10 principles is doing policy governance. There is a policy governance model that I'll also describe that is one way to implement the 10 principles. So here they are. Ownership. The board acts as informed agents of the owners. Now, who are the owners of your school?
The community and the students.
Parents and students.
It's actually the taxpayers of the state of Utah. They're the ones who funded you and authorized you through the legislature. The position of the board. The board is accountable to the owners. It is not an advisory link. It's not in an advisory role. The board does not advise. It is an active link in the chain of command. All authority in the organization flows through the board. Without the board, there is no authority in the organization at all. Board holism. The authority of the board is held and used as a body. No individual board member has any power on their own. Many of your boards probably follow some of these principles already. You can't act unless there's been a vote taken, and those are the only binding actions on the organization. So these are not, Carver did not invent these. He gathered them and organized them. Ends. Oh, did I skip? Okay, ends. The board defines in writing its expectations. When I say ends, probably a better word would be outcomes, the things you expect from the students having passed through your school. Board means, this is the board's own job description. Executive limitations. These are limitations on operational means. These are things that are unacceptable even if they worked. We'll talk about all of these things later on. Policy sizes. Broad to narrow. Your first set of policies are extremely broad, and you add more refined policies, narrow policies, as necessary until you will accept any reasonable interpretation. Which is 9. 8 is clarity and coherence of delegation. There is an unambiguous authority and responsibility for delegatees. That would be the CEO, or a board committee. No committee, etc., can be given jobs that interfere with or are duplicated by the CEO. And the last one is the board will monitor regularly the organizational performance against previously stated ends and the executive limitations. So these are the principles of policy governance. We will see these several times throughout the next few minutes. This is policy governance. This is the policy governance model. So the board defines its own role. There are 4 sets of policies: the board's role, the CEO's role, and the relationship with the board. That's a separate set of policies. The ends, things you must do, and the executive limitations, the things you mustn't do. And then monitoring all of these. So again, if you're following these 10 principles, you are doing policy governance. I've color-coded these into 4 quadrants. And we'll talk about why the concentric circles soon. On the left are the board's instructions to itself. These include the governance process policies and the board management delegation policies. On the right are the instructions to the CEO, the board's instructions to the CEO. These include the ends and the executive limitations. We'll talk about the governance process policies first. These policies address who is the ownership. There is no board outside of a lawfully held board meeting. No individual member has any authority. Here's an example of an actual governance process policy. This is Odyssey's. But this comes from the Carver template. John Carver and Miriam Carver have a template that you can just rip off. And that's what it's designed for. It's a starting point that you can steal and modify to suit your organization's needs. The board will direct, control, and inspire the school through careful establishment of broad written policies reflecting the board's values and perspectives. The board's major policy focus will be on the intended long-term impacts outside the school, not on the administrative or programmatic means of attaining those effects. What I think is interesting about these kinds of policies is that you can see that it's bootstrapping. This policy here describes more policies to come. That first sentence says, we're going to write some ends or the desired outcomes. The governance process policies also describe fiduciary duties that are inherent in any public body. Board members will have unconflicted loyalty to the organization, respect confidential matters, and be prepared for deliberation. That's basic duty of care and loyalty. Here's the policy that describes that. The board will enforce upon itself whatever discipline is needed to govern with excellence. Discipline will apply to matters such as attendance, preparation for meetings, policy-making principles, respective roles, and ensuring the continuance of governance capability. Although the board can change its governance process policies at any time, it will scrupulously observe those currently in force. This reinforces the fiduciary duty of obedience. You must obey your documents as a board. You have no options there. You must obey the federal law, state law, Utah State Office of Education policies, your charter, your bylaws, and your board policies. This is non-negotiable. Okay, board management delegation policies. These are the, I'll just read John Carver. The CEO function enables the board to focus on the organization as a whole rather than on divisions of labor within the organization. So the board management delegation policies define the relationship between the board and CEO qua organization. Here's an actual delegation policy. The CEO is the board's only link to operational achievement and conduct, so that all authority and accountability of staff, as far as the board is concerned, is considered the authority and accountability of the CEO. This looks like, there's a picture that I've made. This is the chain of command or moral authority. It goes from the ownership to the board, to the CEO, to the staff. And the CEO is the staff as far as the board is concerned. The board does not go around, ever. And that line is the only official link between board and staff. To the board, the CEO is the ownership in microcosm. The board instructs the CEO with desired achievements as ends and undesirable situations as executive limitations. Here is the actual policy that covers this. The board will develop policies instructing, here's that bootstrapping again. The board will develop policies instructing the CEO to achieve specified results. These policies will develop systematically from the broadest, most general level to more defined levels will be called ends policies. All issues that are not ends issues as defined here are means issues. So that's the definition of a means. It's just not an end. It's easy. Is it an end? No, then it's a means. And we'll come to why that's important later. Okay, board management delegation policies permit delegated authority to use any reasonable interpretation of policy to accomplish ends. Here's an example of policy. As long as the CEO uses any reasonable interpretation of the board's ends and executive limitation policies, the CEO is authorized to establish all further policies, make all decisions, take all actions, establish all practices, and pursue all activities. Such decisions of the CEO shall have full force and authority as if decided by the board. That's a powerful policy. It tells the board, back off. Once you've delegated and you've stated your policies, you let them do their job. Yes?
So the quote, or the reference at the bottom, is that to your report?
This is Odyssey. Yeah, these are in Odyssey's policies, which are, I think, publicly available. You can steal them.
Okay.
And is this also, a lot of this based on Carver, did you say?
Yes. In fact, many of these will match up with John Carver's nonprofit template for boards. Yeah. These have been adapted. The word school, for example, there's just kind of been some searching and replacing going on from the template from organization to school. Yeah, this is one of my favorite policies, and I think it's our director's favorite policy too, because it draws the line. Directors love this one. It clarifies the point that this is not a permission-seeking model. If the CEO has to come to the board for everything, can I do this? Can I do this? Can I do this? You're doing it wrong. You're telling your CEO, we don't trust you. We know better, even though we're not professionals in this thing. So permission-seeking models are really frustrating to work with as the one having to seek permission. So what happens when the board isn't pleased with some of the decisions, right? That could happen. You can imagine scenarios where, well, we did not think about that. Here's a policy. The board may change its ends and executive limitations policies, thereby shifting the boundary between the board and the CEO domains. By doing so, the board changes the latitude of choice given to the CEO. But as long as any particular delegation is in place, the board will respect and support the CEO's choices. If you don't like it, make a new policy. And be reasonable so that the director has time to implement. It is not adversarial. You really have to have a good relationship with your CEO. The ends and executive limitations constitute 100% of the board's instructions to the CEO. I'll repeat that a few times, not right now, but as we go on, it'll make more sense. This is the last board management delegation issue we'll bring up. The board monitors organizational performance through the CEO's compliance with policy. If the CEO is accomplishing the board's stated ends and avoiding situations described in the executive limitations, the CEO and the organization are considered successful. We're going to now talk about the board's instructions to itself. We've just covered those. The board's instructions to the CEO or the director. Ends describe what the organization is for, why it exists. They describe the desired effects on the recipients and provide a consistent measurable framework for organizational achievement. Ends, a good end, finishes the phrase, our school exists so that, that's an end. So that why? So that students will, you can think of a dozen things what your school wants to focus on. Ends describe the desired effects of the organization on the intended recipients or students, not the methods used to achieve those ends or other recipients. There's that phrase again. So when we first try to start writing ends, we usually focus on methods because that's what we're most familiar with. We'll say these kinds of things, right? These sound like phrases right out of our charter. Ends should reinforce the charter promises. Do you see the difference? Notice the noun and the verb subject. See the difference? If you dictate the means, you have just given the director an excuse for failure. Because if those means are not good means, then the director can say, well, I'm doing the thing you wanted me to do, but you're not accomplishing the thing we wanted you to accomplish. Well, you've tied my hands because you've said I have to do it this way. If I asked my daughter Brooke to go run an errand for me, and I say, go to Harmon's and buy some Meadow Gold 2% milk. Let's pretend she has her driver's license. She's 17. Dang it.
She's working on it.
I know. If the store's closed, or they don't have Meadow Gold milk, or 2%, or the milk is expired, I may not get any milk, or I may not get any good milk. So I'm dictating the means and the ends together. If I say something like this, get some good milk. Don't get expired milk. Don't get these brands. Don't get milk that's less than 2%. Don't spend more than this. Now, if the store's closed, she'll go over to Macy's. She may see that Winder Dairy is having a special and she can get that at a better price. She may go rent a cow and milk it. That would be very fresh milk. Why do I care? I don't care. Because all I wanted was good milk at a reasonable price, right? That meets these criteria. I do not care how it was done. In that case, I probably would care a little bit, but you may not come home smelling like a barn. So when the board prescribes means, it gives the CEO an excuse for failure. When I specify the ends and say, but don't do these things, well, there's a lot of other options now that the CEO has. It just knows where he or she just knows where the landmines are, or the fence, right? We'll use the fence. And here's the thing. A CEO is someone who is an expert in buying milk. And I think back to when we started Odyssey, and it was so presumptuous of me to think that I knew better than a seasoned professional how to run a school. And that I would know that the techniques and the methods that we prescribed would never be improved upon. And I've learned a lot in the last, it's been 10 years since we started Odyssey, that really the best thing you can do is to hire a capable, excellent CEO and tell them where the fence is and let them run. This is what policy governance does. Okay, let's talk for a moment about executive limitations. So if ends are the objectives or the goals or what you want, the executive limitations is the fence. You may not go over the fence. You may not go around the fence. You may not go under the fence. You may not cut a hole through the fence. Stay within the fence. Anything else than that, that's up to you. You can do it. They describe in proscriptive terms situations, activities, decisions, or practices the CEO may not cause or allow. So almost all executive limitations start with the CEO shall not. There's that phrase. Here's an example of an actual executive limitation. This is a global executive limitations policy. Now, you remember, see the concentric circles here? This is that outermost one. There's only one of them, and it is the global executive limitations policy. The CEO shall not cause or allow any organizational practice, activity, or decision or circumstance that is either unlawful, imprudent, a material deviation of the school's bylaws, etc., or unethical. Don't do anything stupid, is what it says. And when there is not a policy in place, you can almost always go to this and say, what made you think you could come to school without pants? We didn't have a policy. Well, that was, you know, it's in there. So here's a level 2 policy. The A, there's an A through G, H, I.
I think I've seen an F, haven't we?
Oh, it goes past, yeah, I think there's maybe 8. Each letter refers to a category. A refers to CEO's interaction with parents and students. So here's a level 2. With respect to interactions with parents and students, the CEO shall not cause or allow conditions, procedures, or decisions that are unsafe, untimely, undignified, or unnecessarily intrusive. So what's an example of this? Maybe the CEO wants to send a staff member to the home of each new student to ensure the home is respectable or whatever. That would be undignified and intrusive. This policy just, you know, if that idea ever hit a CEO, not that CEOs, you know, ever have bad ideas, but if it were to happen, it would go, okay, check. You know, it's just a way to check. Maybe the CEO fails to ensure that scheduled changes are sent out to parents on time. Fails to ensure that the sidewalks are free of ice during the winter. This policy covers those kinds of things. Here is a B policy at the same level. This is talking about faculty and staff. The CEO may not cause or allow conditions that are unfair, undignified, disorganized, or unclear. There will be times when the staff has a beef with the director. This gives the board a means of testing whether it's a legitimate beef. The staff says, we don't like something. The board may, from time to time, the board should be monitoring this policy at least annually. The board receives evidence from wherever, and they can see, you know, that we can understand you're frustrated with this, but it is not, it's still within the CEO's authority to do this. So, you know, you'll have to take this up with the CEO. But if it is one of these things, well, you know, maybe the CEO's favoring blatantly, nepotism, whatever. There's things happening. any of these things would be, hey, director, you may not do that per this policy. Oh, okay, we can fix that. Let's fix it. Here's an F. CEO shall not cause or allow corporate assets to be unprotected and inadequately maintained or unnecessarily risked. This is basic duty of care. And that is it. Those are the 4 policies: the board's instructions to itself and the board's instructions to the CEO. So as we mentioned that these policies are, Carver talks about them as if they were nested bowls, smaller in the middle. Here are 3 areas of policy. G talks about compensation and benefits. H talks about board communication, and I talks about grants and contracts. You see that they're categorized. How much policy is necessary? Excuse me. Well, 2G says that with respect to compensation and benefits, the CEO shall not cause or allow jeopardy to financial integrity or to public image. That may not be clear enough, so we make a level 3 policy that says the CEO shall not promise or imply permanent or guaranteed employment. It's just a little bit refinement of the policy below it. I says the CEO may not enter into any grant or contract arrangements that fail to emphasize primarily the production of the board's stated ends. If you're going to go get money and there's strings attached, make sure that that money is for the achievement of our ends, not for a new parking lot surface or something, right? If we're going to be encumbered, let's do it for the reason that the school exists. H talks about, level 2H says the CEO shall not cause or allow the board to be uninformed or unsupported in its work. 3H is a refinement of that. It says the CEO shall not allow the board to be without decision information required periodically by the board or let the board be unaware of relevant trends. We stopped here at 3H, and at 1 year, our enrollment had dropped for some reason, and the board, we went most of the year and didn't know it. And because of this, we lost a lot of money. We were really scraping the bottom of the barrel that year because our enrollment was down. So we added the 4H, which says the CEO shall not fail to monitor and inform the board every regularly scheduled board meeting or as often as necessary of key enrollment metrics. So that is very specific. Now, it's kind of funny because these executive limitations are sort of backdoor, you need to do this, but they're phrased as a you shall not fail to do the thing, right? So this, now that Odyssey monitors every board meeting, its enrollment, we've never had a problem ever with our enrollment being under where we need it to be. So how many levels do you go? You go until you are until the board will accept any reasonable interpretation of that policy. That's it, and then you stop. If we got to 3H, if our director was already giving us enrollment metrics every meeting, we would not have had a 4H. So we would have stopped. We were not getting what we needed as a board.
Or if it never popped up as a problem. So a lot of
Yes.
these things develop because they're an issue at one point.
Exactly. Exactly right. So how do you create policy then? Start with as broadly as possible. You can steal Odysseys. Once the board is satisfied with the level of detail in a policy, it permits any reasonable interpretation of that policy by the CEO. We crafted most of our policies with the CEO present so that we could get immediate feedback. Are we stating this clearly? Do you understand? Yeah, I think I do understand. You want this. Okay, I think we're okay here. We don't need to go anymore. Let's move on to another thing. So here's one of our ends. Students will be well educated. That's a pretty broad end. If you had the best director, like Julie, you could stop right there.
Yeah.
And then you just let her go. Now, we might not think that's enough. So we clarify this. We have a level 2 policy. A talks about literacy. B talks about numeracy. C talks about Latin grammar and vocabulary. So let's say we have a policy that says students will know Latin grammar. The CEO interprets this to mean that students will be familiar with all of the Latin magic spells in the Harry Potter books. The board may refine this end by clarifying with another level of policy. Once the board has narrowed, this is a quote from Carver, narrowed its words to the point that it can accept any reasonable interpretation of those words, the board has reached the point of delegation. So we've covered the board's instructions to itself, to the CEO. We're going to talk about monitoring. We are getting close to the end here. The purpose of monitoring is to assess how well the CEO is accomplishing ends and staying within the executive limitations. Any other information is not monitoring information and should be limited by the board. This means the board sometimes has to politely say no thank you to some reports that really should go to the director instead. Many boards are accustomed to hearing about everything going on, and there's nothing wrong with that, but boards generally should limit the amount of information that is not monitoring information. It's not helpful. The board can solicit additional information as it needs to. How well is the director, how numerate are our students? Well, we are going to need some test scores for that, because that's easy to test, right? This is a quote from a board management delegation policy. Systematic and rigorous, another bootstrapping policy, systematic and rigorous monitoring of the CEO job performance will be solely against the only expected CEO job outputs: organizational accomplishment of board's policies on ends, and organizational operation within the boundaries established in board policies on executive limitations. Another one that I'll read to you, the board will view CEO performance as identical to organizational performance so that organizational accomplishment of board-stated ends and avoidance of board-prescribed means will be viewed as successful CEO performance. And here's one more policy. All policies that instruct the CEO, ends, executive limitations, will be monitored at a frequency and by a method chosen by the board. The board can monitor any policy at any time by any method, but will ordinarily depend upon a routine schedule. So, the board monitoring schedule is the tool that enables the board to fulfill its commitment to monitoring CEO or organizational performance. So use a monitoring schedule. Our monitoring schedule covers all of the policies at least once annually. Certain financial policies we cover quarterly, and the 3H that you saw earlier we cover 4H monthly, every month, or every scheduled board meeting.
And a few that we thought were important, like literacy, we're covering twice a year, or
some ends we also cover twice. Yeah, that's right. I wasn't planning on talking about this, but there are 3 primary methods that boards use to gather information. One is direct report. That's where the director provides the data, and it's it's firsthand kind of data, stuff that they wouldn't really fake or whatever. There is what we would call a direct inspection, where the board authorizes a member of the board or a committee of the board to go and get the information. For example, one of these might be coming and visiting with the office staff to ensure that records are locked in a safe place, that FERPA is being complied with, etc. There's a third method, which would be a third-party audit, for lack of a better term. All of our Odyssey's financials are audited by a certified public accountant at least once a year, and that data is presented as evidence that the CEO is in compliance with our financial laws, our policies. So, good questions, thank you. Are the students literate? Yes. Do you have any evidence of this? Nope. Well, let's get some evidence. What evidence do you get? The board typically does also not prescribe the mode of evidence, although, a lot of it would be, are the students numerate? Test scores are a really good way to tell if students are numerate. Literacy is a little bit harder. How well are students reading? There's Dibbles tests and things, and that shows how quickly they can read, but it doesn't show comprehension. You know, there's lots of ways, and it's really up to the CEO to demonstrate students are learning. Here are the ways that we're trying to assess this, and we've brought in some third-party people to help us do that. Dr. Brian Carpenter often used the phrase, the board's job is to ask how well are things going, how well are the students learning, how well are you doing, director. The director's job is to ask how will I do this. It's the executive function. Figure it out. Here are the 10 principles of policy governance. We've covered these. Each of these finds a place in the different policy areas and monitoring. 4 broad policy areas: instructions to self, instructions to the CEO, trust but verify. So you need to make sure that you invest the time and money necessary to strengthen your board's ability to govern well. You need to read things, you need to try things, you need to talk about it openly in your board meetings, attend conferences and get the training you need. You have fiduciary duties of care, loyalty, and obedience. So set aside some time in board meetings to assess specific promises and assurances you've made in your charter to your students. How well is your CEO doing? Do you have ways to assess the CEO based on charter outcomes? Are you tying your CEO's hands with prescriptive ends rather than proscriptive means? These are questions that good boards should be asking. And with that, that is it. A good board will invest in its capacity to govern. And that's, it costs money. It's not, you know.
Typically, how much do you set aside to do that? You know, do you think it's reasonable?
A few $1,000s a year.
Okay.
You know.
Do you do that on a weekend? Do you do it, you know, how's that
yes.
look?
We've done it in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's going to a conference. Sometimes, well, most often, at least at Odyssey, it has been hiring a consultant to come in and take a weekend, a Friday night and a Saturday morning, or Saturday most of the day, or something like that. If you're really gonna, you know, get serious about it, it's a commitment, and we need to set aside a couple days. Sometimes it will be an hour after a board meeting, you know, to, you know, just let's remember these principles that we're trying to do here. Again, if you're doing the 10 principles, however you're doing them, if you've drawn, you know, if you have clear policies and you've drawn lines between the board's role and the CEO's role, you're monitoring, you're doing policy governance. Yeah, it's not easy. It does take commitment. If you can find board members who are willing to obey their documents and have, you know, fiduciary duties of care and loyalty, you can do. It doesn't take high-performing board members to do well at a school. It does take a good CEO.
Well, the dedication, commitment, you know, the mission
yes,
of the school.
that's really what you need more is people willing to do it, to be there, to follow up.
So thank you
You're
so
welcome.
much.
Yeah,
Thank
absolutely.
you.